people in, so thank you ever so much for joining us this evening. We're absolutely delighted this evening to be joined by Maggie Ferguson for a start off, so that's always good to be working with Maggie. But we're delighted to be joined by John Burnside, who's a Scottish poet and novelist who's won almost every prize going, and he's in conversation with Fiona Sampson, a prize-winning poet. John's written about grandfathers in the tablet recently, and Fiona has written for the first time about being adopted. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maggie. This forms part of our tablet webinar series on family matters. Many thanks for joining us. Over to you, Maggie. You're just on mute, Maggie.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And it is particularly exciting to have John and Fiona tonight, who've both been garlanded with practically every prize possible. But John last week won the David Cohen Prize for Literature, which is, well, financially, after the Booker, I think it's the biggest prize in this country, and it's for a lifetime's contribution to literature, and they have never chosen a dud winner. So it's been won by Seamus Heaney, V.S. Naipaul, Muriel Spark, Hilary Mantel, the list goes on. And John is absolutely perfect for this prize, as anyone who has read his work knows. I think I've been reading him now for nearly 20 years, and I'm always telling people they must go to not just his memoirs, but his poetry, his essays, his fiction. He's just absolutely brilliant. So Fiona and John have both written about aspects of their lives, each of them for the first time. So Fiona has written an incredibly moving piece, and I have to say there were tears in the office when it came in, about being adopted. Fiona is, I hope she won't mind my saying that she's now 60, and this is the first time she has written about this subject, and it is very deeply moving. And John has written about his grandfather and being a grandfather, and he's written about both of those things for the first time. And his piece is just absolutely brilliant. Brendan said he was in the office going through tablet copy, trying to get the next issue ready, feeling very, very tired. And he read John's piece again, and he said he just felt on a kind of high. He just thought how thrilling to be publishing this. So each of them is going to read from their pieces for about 3 minutes, and then we'll move into a conversation. So which of you would like to start? Fiona, do you want to start, as yours was published first?
If you like, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not going to introduce it, obviously, because it's in the tablet. I'd guess few adoptees are overly sentimental about blood ties. Most of us were abandoned by our birth parents, after all. Still, even pretty unpleasant people tend to do better at loving their own kids than caring for strangers with whom they have no narcissistic bond. The success of an adoption depends in disproportionate measure upon the generosity and the transparency of the particular adopters' hearts. For there are extra pressures on adoptive families. Most have been configured by loss. For every party in the adoption triangle, the adoptee embodies something that is missing, and she can all too easily become the gap between family ties. Contrary to expectations, adoption mends nothing. It simply offers its own forms of richness and compromise. Adoptive parents have often experienced childlessness, or worse, the loss of a particular child. Society rehearses this story. There's also an emerging pattern of state apologies to birth mothers for forced adoption policies. Less acknowledged, it seems, is the loss experienced by the third party in every adoption, the babies and children actually being passed to and fro. Always already charity cases, we often seem to be objects, whether of sentimental pity or contempt, rather than subjects, even within our own stories. I could never understand my adoptive mother's refrain, "Poor Fiona," until one day about a decade ago, when I brought home a dog from a rescue centre. Juno was a collie cross who had been horribly mistreated on a hill farm. Ah, how nice, my adoptive mother said. That's just like when we brought you home. No, it is not. I am not an animal. I, too, am that perhaps transcendent thing, a human self. Being a charity case doesn't alter this. I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Yea, who knoweth not such things as these? I choke up every time Jude scrawls Job's great challenge on the walls of Thomas Hardy's Christminster. Yet the sense of what Robin Robertson in his poem Act in the Early Years calls being the wrong child seems unchanging. Recently, I came across a faint old Kodachrome snap, which must have been taken when I was about 4. There among the adults is a little girl in a pink dress who ducks her head and cannot look at the camera. I'm no longer her, but I know exactly how she feels. When my adoptive father died a couple of years ago, the officiating priest, who has known my adoptive mother for decades, made clear that I was not among the next of kin and should not sit in the chief mourner's pew. It took me a while to follow what was being said. Is it only the widow who? Finally, I understood. Just as at the beginning of my life, I am not family. Like the little girl in the fading photo, I am just the trace of something other than myself.
Wow. Well, you can see why there were tears in the office when that came in. John, are you ready to read a bit?
Yes, I hope so. Apologies if I start coughing, but hopefully I can make it through that. Like many boys of my generation, I was named after my maternal grandfather, a coal miner from West 5. John Cameron Burnside was not an easy man to love. He could be severe, authoritarian, and immovably stubborn. But he was also admired for his stoicism, his deep faith, and his unrelenting determination to do what was right. Growing up, I was frequently regaled with the story, the legend really, of his long persecution by 5 police, who would regularly detain him on the streets of Cross Hill, accuse him falsely of being drunk, and throw him in a holding cell to sober up. He was Catholic, they were Protestant, and in those days, sectarian prejudice was both casual and ubiquitous. To add to the perceived humiliation, the constables would make this giant of a man remove his belt and empty his pockets, bagging up his few possessions and returning them at first light, when he would be released without charge. They knew that he was powerless. The law was all in their favor. He had mouths to feed and a job that he could not afford to lose. Yet in spite of their efforts, he weathered these trials with dignity, his quiet stoicism illumining the farce that he had to endure with a glint of wry humor. And so, on all but one occasion, he simply played the game and headed home as if nothing had happened. The one exception to this routine came when a single property item was not returned on his release. As a working-class family man, living hand-to-mouth through the Depression years, my grandfather owned nothing of financial worth, but he did have an inexpensive rosary that he always kept in his coat pocket, and he knew it had been there on the previous evening when he was brought in. Normally, in spite of the sectarian motives for his arrest, that rosary would be returned on his release, but on this particular morning the constables denied ever having seen it, and when he insisted, they informed them that should he continue to argue the point, he would be arrested in earnest and charged with something more serious than public intoxication. So it was that, recognizing his predicament and aware that his shift would soon be starting, John Cameron left the station that day, though he was no means done with the 5 police. Had the constable stolen his money, he would probably have let it go, but he could not give up the rosary, and so every day without fail, he returned to the constabulary and politely inquired as to whether or not the missing item had turned up. He was a big man, but he remained calm, courteous, and respectful. He once said to me that we treat others decently, not necessarily because they deserve it, but because it would shame us to do otherwise. At the same time, it was clear to his adversaries that he would never give in, no matter what they did. And after 10 days, one of the constables capitulated and handed over what, for him, would be nothing more than a cheap trinket.
Thank you very much. Well, I've got piles of questions I'd love to ask you, but I really want, most of all, to listen to you asking each other questions. So, whichever way round you want to go, unless you want to ask something to kick things off. But I know that Fiona's got questions. I'm sure that John has questions too.
John, I've got a question about time in your piece. I mean, one of the things I loved about it was, you know, obviously you move from your grandfather, the role model. I don't want to summarize, but, and, you know, we arrive at your grandson, and it's quite unusual to read something actually which folds over time like that, or moves from one to the other. And I had a lovely sense of possibility, you know, because of time opening out at both ends, you know, backwards and forwards.
Interesting. I've been thinking a lot. I'm at the age when you think a lot about time, I suppose. But I think it's because I'm working on something now which is almost entirely to do with time, as in the sense of time running out for a character. So this is a fictional piece. Time running out for a character, and somebody that person trying to reorganize their memories and cut through what we all do, which is when we remember something, we tell ourselves a version of the past that we like. And he's trying for the first time, perhaps his whole life, as his life runs out, to try and figure out what the truth, whatever that is. I mean, you know, we can't ever know what the past what actually happened in the past, other than the basic facts. So I'm very interested in that the way in which we play the games that we play with memory, and the way in which we tell ourselves versions of the past, and the way in which we also tell others sometimes different versions of the past, and of course the way in which we tell different people or different groups of people, you know, versions that are tailored to that relationship. So yeah, it's kind of a kind of current preoccupation, I suppose, this whole question of time, or time and memory.
Time and memory. Yeah, I've been I'm working on a biography of George Sand, and you know, her autobiography is called Histoire de ma vie, and obviously I don't have to tell you that Histoire is both story and what happened. It doesn't have that Anglo-Saxon division between the fact and the telling of the fact. It knows they're indivisible, because an unwitnessed fact, you know, is like the tree in the forest, you know, or the tree in the quad, you know, did it fall? And of course, she is a very unreliable narrator, in fact.
I think the trouble with our view of history is that we see history as narrative, but we don't live our I don't live my day-to-day life, as it were, as a narrative. I don't come home from a day at the office and make it into a story. It was just a series of events that happened.
Do you not have a mental voiceover?
Not really, no. What do you mean, the mental voice? I'm not sure what that means.
Well, some people have a voice going all the time, don't they? I don't mean like hearing voices. I mean their thoughts.
Like having a spouse.
Yeah.
Like having a spouse. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Not quite, but you know, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. I mean, don't they? Do you not have someone saying, well, either John walked up the stairs, or
no,
what on earth am I going to do about this? So the what on earth am I going to do about this would just present itself as a feeling, not words.
That'd be a feeling, wouldn't it? Yeah. I wouldn't.
It's not automatic, I think, because some people do have that, apparently.
Well, when you read,
people don't.
When you read stream of consciousness novels, you do see that, don't you? You see people. But is that because of the device of stream of consciousness fiction? I don't know. Maybe that's what that is. I mean, it's interesting because from the moment we're born, we hear stories. and we tell stories to each other, and history is a story, and you can't. It's very hard to convey a lot of things that you want to convey people without framing them in some way, in some kind of quasi narrative, if not an entirely, entirely formed narrative. But I actually think of narratives as being a little bit kind of tyrannical, because if there's one story, then if you tell a story, then it's the one story. Then all the other possible stories get excluded by that story. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. But does that mean that when we tell a story, it's like a parable? It's, if you want to talk about something abstract or a principle or something, you have to dress it up in narrative always.
Yeah, or metaphor, I suppose.
Yeah, that's.
I always like it when people suddenly produce metaphor in unexpected situations, like that time when that famous footballer, it was Eric Cantona, said something about the seagulls following the ship when they throw away the fish or something. It was in the middle of an interview about soccer, and suddenly he started talking about seagulls and fish and trawlers. And obviously he intended to try and convey something that he couldn't figure out how to convey in the terms that the interviewer wanted him to convey.
Yeah, although it's interesting, isn't it, that you can't remember what it is that he was trying to convey. You remember the image and not the conveyance and not the conveyed.
Yeah, exactly. Only the image says, but maybe that's because he didn't actually convey translate the image into what he was intending to say. But I often want to respond to people when they tell me something, expecting me to engage in the fabrication of a narrative. I often want to just throw in something completely left field, some image, or because it just feels as though I'm being guided into a way of looking at the world, which doesn't feel natural to me particularly.
Fiona, I think we ought to come around to you. John, would you like to ask Fiona a question, or shall I ask her a question? What?
Yeah, my question to Fiona is actually a very simple, basic one. Is had I been had the experiences that you're recounting here, I would have written about them long ago, because I wondered why you've taken so long to kind of circle around to talking about this in particular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one answer might be, I guess, that writing biographies is why am I writing biographies? Because that's a story or a narrative or a metaphor, a way to talk about myself. I have real issues with talking about myself. I mean, notice I just read, well, you probably don't notice because, you don't have my essay written on your heart, but I can tell you that I read the most impersonal bit, and that my first go at the essay was had nothing about me. It was polemic about the state of adoption. I'm not sure whether I think of myself as a flickering image, which isn't stably there. And when I try and write about myself, I get lost. And obviously a cure for that is dealing with why I don't have a sense of self. And therefore, that's something I've spent several years doing, which is why it's only now that I'm beginning to think I could. Also, I don't want to write a misery memoir. I mean, A Lie About My Father is just an amazing book, and it is not misery memoir. And you're a great artist and so on. I wouldn't want to write anything that was less transformed than that. And I'm not sure if I can do that. So that's why I haven't. Also, who's interested in me? Who wants to know?
We are, Fiona. We're very interested. So we want to know what it was like writing that piece. It sounds like it had to go through a lot of drafts.
It did, very unusually for me. I mean, normally I absolutely love writing. I polish something, I write it, fairly promptly. Then I leave enough time to polish it. It's all very easy and straightforward. And, I know what I am going to say when it starts writing itself, and all of those things that, we know about. And this was a really, really uncomfortable experience, but I really wanted to do it because it was uncomfortable, because I wanted to do something new. I think it's really a key part of life, isn't it? Not to just keep repeating yourself, not to get stuck inside the safety, in fact, of a story. I used to, when I was young, I did a lot of work in hospitals, and I did a lot of reminiscence therapy as well. And I mean, I really noticed how all the people, there's this awful tendency to get stuck in the same few anecdotes that they tell everybody. They tell the person who baths them, they tell the person who toilets them, they tell the person who brings their lunch, and they tell you, the reminiscence therapist. And it's like such a loss of self that you can't reach beyond these little, and I'm not talking about confusion or dementia, I'm just talking about this kind of narrative habit. Oh, here comes anecdote number 3, here comes anecdote number 5. And that seems to me, you know, a kind of loss of human texture in the self. And I think that's sad for everybody. And so therefore it's sad for me too. So
Yeah.
I started writing. I thought, yes, I want to write this. It's a really important question. And as I say, I started writing, although it wasn't polemic in the sense of anger, it was very ideasy, it was very in principle. And I realized this doesn't work at all, you know. Of course, I have to write as one always does, starting with the story, starting with the narrative as the way in. You know, a funny thing happened to me on the way to my writing desk, sort of thing. But it was really hard to do.
Is there a difference when you write that with the writing from the lyric eye of the poem, for example? Because
Yeah.
written stuff that reading it, I mean, obviously one reads into a poem, but seems very based on personal experiences. But is that kind of mask involved with that persona?
It's not a mask, it's more self-transcendence.
Right.
Oh, I leapfrog over myself. And I
Mhm.
look out the window, I'm not looking into. Whereas you, it's so clearly the same voice, it's the same diction almost. Of course it's not. I mean, they're amazing lyric poems and it's amazing prose, but they are so much of a piece. They're so cut from the same fabric. You're doing something and you're doing something else. But clearly there is such a, well, there's such a strong Burnside mark, but there's a territory as well. But there's also, I think you are much more unitary writing self.
Interesting. I think of the way in which I used to go to theatre a lot, and there were certain actors that I loved, and I used to think it interesting. For example, I remember one season Alan Bates did Chekhov and Shakespeare, a series in West End, and I saw them all in Guildford because I was living in Guildford at the time at the Yvonne Arnault Theatre, and the way in which it became these characters, you know. But it was always Alan Bates, whom I loved. I actually kind of adored Alan Bates, you know. And I used to find that really interesting. That who was I watching on stage? Well, what I was watching on stage was the character, but he was being brought to life by Alan Bates, and there was something always Alan Batesy about the character, and yet that never took away from the character. And when I feel like when I write in a piece, anything that seems to be, from my perspective, as it were, I feel as though that's the character that I am playing in that moment. I don't know if you feel that as well, but you know,
I feel it more the other way around. That's to say that when I try not to think about myself, she said, talking about herself, I try not to think about myself at all when I'm writing, because it gets entirely in the way, because it's the thing I trust least. But I notice that in prose particularly, I definitely have thumbprints. I definitely have a fingerprint. Oh yes, I hate saying voice, but that's my diction. Yeah, that's my idiom. That's me thinking aloud. This is me. And I have quite a strong sense of looking in the mirror. Yeah, that's when I read back. Okay, yes, that's me. Yeah, but I don't feel that with poetry. I feel like the poetry is more freestanding. I mean, in the way that, like, if you made a pot on a wheel, somehow it would be you who'd made it, and one would make the same kind of pots because one has one's abilities and one's techniques, but it would be it wouldn't be autobiographical in any way. Whereas I can kind of, oh yes, this is Fiona going on a bit. In prose, it's definitely, I can hear my voice, you know.
Oh, another question that came to mind reading your piece was, and you didn't talk much about them because of the limited space, but I got a strong sense of your adoptive mother from it. I mean, I guess I didn't much like her, but your adoptive father seemed more kind of further back in the shadows, as it were.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that was deliberate, or whether you were shielding him from something.
Very nice of you. Thank you. Well, I wrote a little bit about my adoptive father in my last prose book, which is about romantic countryside, because it sort of wasn't meant to be, but it turned out to be a little bit homagey, because kind of he introduced me to kind of looking, and I loved him. I love him, and he died 3 years ago, during lockdown. So I kind of had done some thinking about him and some grieving, and probably a double grieving, a kind of grieving that he died, but also grieving because he can't ever be my father. He's not my father. He's not mine. So that's double loss. And that, I think, is probably what, and it was that was what made me mention in a review for Maggie about, it was a review of, is it Liz Berry, the collection where her aunt is an institutional child who's sent off overseas. And I said something like, as someone whom this very nearly happened to, because it did, I was within 3 days of being put in the Quorum Foundation, I think there needs to be, I have strong feelings about this. I won't rehearse what I felt about the book. And so that was a little crack in the carapace. And then Maggie very astutely kind of noticed and remembered and asked me for the series, which I was very grateful for, because it's always lovely to be asked to write something. And Maggie, you were sort of super sort of sensitive and delicate, and oh, please don't if you don't want to, and very, you can do this any way you want to, and so on, which is very enabling.
Well, I'm glad. Well, obviously we feel very kind of honoured to have this piece, but it's true, it's interesting about your father, and the business of the funeral is just so deeply shocking. I wonder if that
really
has happened to other people, or whether it was just some sort of bastard priest who
I don't know
that happened. I can't believe that that's what normally happens.
I know, I can't believe it does normally. I think there's quite a lot of, as people get very old, they disown more, they become more, it's storytelling again, the story shifts. The story about, okay, let's pretend to be a family, shifts to, oh, I did these good works when I was young, and one of them was this annoying person whom I brought up, But actually talking about fathers, I wanted to ask you, John, about masculinity. Sorry to ask you that, but you're giving us such a kind of, a very interesting, very benign, kind of stabilized, contained model of masculinity in your maternal grandfather, aren't you, in your piece?
Yeah, I mean, he was somewhat curmudgeonly in his older years,
right.
But I mean, he was very principled. So he did for reasons that made sense to him in kind of principled terms. I mean, my mother and her aunts, my aunts rather, would tell the story of how these were grown women. They were all working at the place like the Co-op and stuff. They asked him if they could go out to a kind of dance type event, and he said yes, be back by 10. These are 21-year-old, 20-year-olds. He had 12 children, and of course they said yes, so they could go. And of course he didn't let them wear lipstick, etc. So they hid all that stuff outside, and when they left the house, they got all dolled up in their lipstick, and off they went to the dance. And he knew, of course, that they wouldn't come back at 10. So at 10 o'clock, the hall was quite close by. At 10 o'clock, he appeared in his dressing gown and his what we in Scotland called his bathies, his little tartan slippers. He appeared and walked into the hall, and he looked at me and said, "Get that muck off your face and get home." He said 10 o'clock, and it's 10 o'clock now. And he stayed. It was a piece of theatre, really, because he staged it. And they were hot. They were appalled and embarrassed and stuff in front of their friends. But also they knew. I think probably they knew he'd do something like that, because that's how he was. And I remember as a child, we went out somewhere as a family. The people who had cars drove us out, and we went in. It was, I guess it must have been a Sunday, and you could go to a hotel and get an afternoon tea or something, but nothing else was open in Scotland in those days. and we went into this place, and he was wearing his, which he always wore. He wore his bonnet, you know, his hat, flat cap. And he walked into this place, and the barman, the kind of, you know, waiter said to him, "We remove our caps when we come in." And he said, "No, me." And he said, "Well, you know, I mean, you have to remove it." He said, "Well, okay." And he is concerned about all these children, daughters and sons and their spouses and his grandchildren. He said, "Right, I have to remove." And they all walked back, and I used to drive another 20 miles to find a place to have tea, have, you know, supper or whatever. But he just said that, and they all got up and we all traipsed out. So, you know, he was whimsical and authoritarian as well. And he was a man who had suffered a lot from having been in his prime a very big, strong man, and work in the mines and arthritis, which runs in our family, had brought him down. But he was never cowed by anything. But the cost of that would make someone perhaps a little bit rigid in the later years, you know. But yeah, I mean, I think I've got sons, and my sons, one of the things they're appalled by is this constant reference to toxic masculinity. And of course, there is a lot of toxic masculinity around, but we don't talk much about the positive. Yeah. And, you know, if we do talk about positives in terms of men, it makes sense to be perfect. You know, women can just be somewhat virtuous, but, you know, men
women have to be perfect too, John.
depends on the country, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wondered while I was reading it whether I was sort of imagining meeting your grandfather, and whether we would have, as a kind of outsider from the family, if one had met him, would we have seen anything of the kind of gentleness you saw in him, or would we have seen just a totally different person?
You would have seen a very still person.
Still?
Very still. He was always, in his later years, I'm obviously I didn't know him in his early years, but it sounds like they were more energetic. But he was a very still man. He sat very still. He didn't move much. He didn't speak much. Men in Scotland in those days didn't say much, actually, to be honest. They left to talk to women. He was very devout, but he was quietly devout. He didn't talk about his faith, but he spoke about it to me, and you know, he gave me these little tokens of, you know, to remind me of the faith that we were growing up in. But he didn't. He was very quiet and very still to outsiders, like a rock, a bit like a rock. You know, you experience him as a kind of natural object, like a rock or a tree, unless something happens to kind of move him into action, as it were.
And that faith, have you inherited it at all?
That's certainly when I was a child, but I mean, my view of faith is probably more complicated than his. I think he lives in a less complicated time, I suppose.
Yeah.
I wonder how your grandson will view you, John.
Good question. I don't know. I mean, obviously, the relationship is different because we live together day to day. Whereas I saw my grandfather usually about once every fortnight, maybe once a week, but usually more like once in a fortnight, because they lived in Cross Hill and we lived in Cowdenbeath, so it was and we didn't have a car or anything, so we'd bus over there to see them. And it was going into his domain, which was his and my grandmother's, of course. And my grandmother made this extraordinarily beautiful garden out of soil, which is effectively if that was soil in England, it'd be clinker. You know, it was just coal bits and stuff. And she used to grow these amazing roses and stuff. So we had this domain that we went into, and they lived there. So we were coming into that. Whereas my grandson lives in my house, and it's also his house, and we see each other all the time, etc. So it'd be interesting to know, but of course, one can't really speculate about that given my age.
Yeah. Fiona, I really wanted to ask you, so all the way, there are a lot of things you sort of approach and then leave, and then there are questions in the air. And I suppose the most obvious one is, so we know you found out which hospital you were born in, and we know where your mother lived, your birth mother. Did you find her?
Yes. Yeah. And I finally found my father, but not till after he was dead. Yeah. Yeah, I did. In fact, I found her quite early on. I mean, like in my early 20s, actually. And it is very, very nice when you have grown up without anyone who's a blood relative to meet someone you look like. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I did have this very strange experience of, we went out to eat. We went to a restaurant, and there were mirrors in Earl's Court, and there were mirrors on the walls. And I looked across and saw myself in the mirror, and it was her. And, you know, I have always been the odd one out. I have never looked like anybody else. And that, you know, was lovely. And I do have half brothers on both sides, only one of whom I've met. But for him, it was very striking because I do resemble my birth mother a lot. And apparently I have the same idioms as her. I mean, the same body language as her. So for him, it was really quite striking and quite sort of uncanny in a way, because they're Northerners. I mean, you know, my father's side are Aussies and my mother's side are Geordie miners. And so they speak differently from me. You know, I'm a soft Southerner, but with the same body language as my, anyway, we're not particularly in touch now.
Is she alive still?
She's alive still. She's only 20 years older than me. And she, I think it's very complicated. We know it's complicated for everybody, but we also know that, you know, there's a whole, as it were, industry around, you know, reuniting. But reuniting, you know, presumes that there's something that was broken asunder. And there isn't always, because not every child was given, not every adoption is forced. Quite a lot of adoptions are, you know, convenient. And although my mother wanted to meet me and she thought that having lost, you know, given me up was the great tragedy of her life, actually it wasn't. The great tragedy of her life was losing the father of my half brothers, and we won't go there, and the instability of her own respectability. And that turns out to have been much more important to her than I am. Just as, I mean, she left my father for the boy's father, so they're younger than me. So, you know, actually her life was complete without me, and that's fine, because I couldn't imagine her as a mother figure anyway. How could you go, as it were, for care or shelter even in your mind to someone who sort of narcissistically abandoned you? I mean, of course not. I mean, you know, but I felt very protective and empathetic. But I think that was a waste of my protective energy, actually.
But it is a very, I mean, I have two friends at the moment, one my age and one goddaughter who's just 18. The one my age was fostered, grew up in foster care, and has just recently found out who his mother was. She's not alive anymore, and found his father. And that means just everything to him. And my goddaughter, who's Chinese, is desperate to find her parents, but she was left on the side of a road, wrapped up in a coat, and she'll never ever find them. And that is driving her
crazy.
bonkers.
Although they do, that is one of the stories that's always told, isn't it? And actually very often they weren't left on the side of it. It's an institutional lie often, like you know, your mother was 16 and she died giving birth to you. Not true, you know. I mean, that's not a lie that was told me, but I know people my age who were told that lie. You know, it's a way to stop you going near looking for, be careful, you know, Pandora's box. But of course, I cannot imagine anyone who wouldn't want to know. Even if you didn't want to have a relationship with, why wouldn't you want to know? It's something about yourself. So
John,
I mean, in fact, sorry.
No, you go.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's been very striking to me often over my life is people who say, oh, well, you know, my parent was adopted and therefore I have unstable identity. And of course, that's something in a lie about my father. You know, John, you write about your father being a foundling. And that being so, as it were, fundamentally, that fundamental absence, that foundational absence of a foundation, and how it trickles down through the generations is one of the reasons I didn't have kids. I didn't want to pass on the sort of oscillating terror, really.
Yeah. Well, particularly with those, or your contemporaries at school. I mean, it's a really shocking lineup of terrible things that happened to the ones who were adopted, isn't it? Like 7 of them or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Because you have this vulnerability, and predators pick up on it. Predators and bullies pick up on it.
Yeah.
However high functioning you think you're being, people's unconsciouses are brilliant. We all have this unconscious brilliance, which allows us to pick up on either, the person who's worst for us, or, whatever it is, don't we? I mean, it's one of the things we know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love you to say something, John, about, your dad being a foundling, because I remember that was so aha-ish for me when I read A Lie About My Father.
Yeah, I didn't know about it while he was alive, and in fact, I didn't know about it. I would never have known about it if I hadn't decided to write a book. And in fact, my original motive for writing A Lie About My Father, which wasn't called that then, of course, was simply to try and figure out what my family history was. Growing up with my father, I knew that, well, one didn't know whether it was 100% lies, 80% lies, 20% lies. One didn't know, but one always knew that he was lying to some extent. And he quite happily admitted to being illegitimate. And he made up an extraordinary kind of elaborate story about who his, and adopted as well, but, and his illegitimate, meant that he was handed on to this other family, who was at one point, he claimed was the brother of his natural father. And then that story varied. So we knew that because the story is varied, that only one of them could be true, therefore the rest was lies, or possibly they're all lies. And in fact, turned out they were. So he was ashamed. He wasn't, I mean, obviously he was probably ashamed of everything, but he wasn't so ashamed that he couldn't tell us that he had been adopted, and that he was illegitimate. But he was ashamed of being a foundling in a way that meant he couldn't tell anybody. He didn't tell anybody about it. And then, of course, I decided to write the story of my family's, or about my family, mainly because my wife has such a great family history, and I was kind of feeling a bit kind of bereft, because when I had a son coming, and I thought a child coming, and I thought, what kind of stories do I have for this child? And I went to see my aunt, who was still alive then, and I said, can you tell me who the family were who brought up my father, etc.? And so, like which one? And I said, well, the one that raised him. And then she told me then that he had been found on the doorstep in 1926 during the general strike in the poorest town in Britain. He was found on the doorstep. So she didn't know all the details, and I still haven't got all of the details, but he was obviously passed from family to family for as long as they could look after him, and they passed him on. And I always remember that there's an expression we have in Scotland, which is, I'd rather keep you a week than a fortnight. So if say you're a big eater, or if you have expensive taste and you're staying with somebody, they say, I'd rather keep you a week than a fortnight. It means, you're imposing upon me somewhat. And my mother used to say it. Whenever I remember when she said it, my father would wince. And I thought, he must have had that said to him. He must have been told, you're taking the bread out of my real children's mouth, and we're looking after you, but only doing it out of the goodness of our hearts, and you won't last forever. And you must have never known how long he'd stay in the place. If he had told us all of those things, imagine how much more forgiving we might have been of his behavior, which was pretty disastrous at times. But of course, he didn't tell us those things. He just told us the lies. And I, like you said, I didn't want to have kids. I didn't want to have kids for various reasons. One was I probably thought I was too much like my father, with a lot of anger issues, obviously. And I didn't have kids till my first child was born when I was 45. but then I decided that, I wasn't going to let myself be limited by the fear that I might turn out to be like him. And what you do when you have kids is that you say, I'm not going to be like my parents or whichever bad parent you had or whatever. And you strive so hard not to be like that you go some other extreme and become a bad parent the other way. So if you had a brutal kind of, controlling parent, you tend to go to the other extent and become too lax and just, draw no boundaries and just let them do what they want. And then they suffer from that. So whatever happens, as Philip Larkin said, parents do some harm
They were
one
fucked
way.
up in their term. Yeah.
There are some so it is 7:15 now, so there are a few questions coming in, and one is specifically for Fiona. So Susan asks, children put up for adoption today are often separated from their mother because of the mother's or parents' addictions or criminalities. I have 2 adopted grandchildren. Can Fiona comment? Don't know.
Well, what can I say? I mean,
Yeah.
Adoption is a good thing. It's the best. It's much better than the alternatives. But it's still very difficult. It's very difficult to do, And I think because we know the positives, which are obvious, it's much better than the child coming to harm or growing up in care, or indeed, from the child's point of view being aborted and not happening, not existing. It is a wise and humane solution, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a developmental effect on a kid.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting what, John's father, of course, he didn't mind being adopted and he didn't mind being illegitimate, but what he minded was the serial abandonment of being passed on from house to house. And it's the abandonment that is so shaming. I mean, even if it's not abandonment, it's not voluntary abandonment, obviously someone who has an addiction problem to the extent where their kids are taken away, at some level, they probably feel they haven't got a choice, but at some level they have chosen the addiction over the child. And there is also simply the structural, we all learn to be human by being alive, through being alive, and in infancy. We learn language, we learn how to walk, we learn how to eat, we learn manners, we learn what it is to be in the world. We also learn how to attach. And if we are constantly trying to attach as a baby, even before you have symbol formation, you try and attach, and then you're handed on to another institutional caregiver, and it happens again, and it happens again, and it happens again. That affects the child's development. It can't not. And anyone who thinks just because a child doesn't remember, somehow it hasn't happened to them, has never seen a baby in arms crying, needing to be handed back to its mum. I mean, it's just kind of obvious common sense. So very much. I mean, as you know, Maggie, because you've obviously published the whole piece. I'm not against adoption. I'm incredibly grateful I didn't grow up in care, but that doesn't mean that once the child is brought through the door of the home, it's problem solved. No, there's lots of work to do.
Yeah. John, there is well, this is a comment rather than a question, but you might turn it into a question. So Kay Parkin says, I agree with John. Positive male role models are essential for providence.
For providence.
Providence. Providence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm cautious because I believe that we do harp on too much about in a very kind of simplistic manner about toxic masculinity, and it just so happens that our media, in the broad sense, I mean, certainly certain TV channels, shall we say, find it's more entertaining to present the worst kind of men on the screen, because we find train wreck TV is entertaining. Of course, the other thing about that though is when we talk about role models according to whose set of values, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And so positive images of men based on, say, a certain set of value, circled around a certain kind of role model, that could be very problematic for me, but work very well for someone else. I remember when David Cameron was talking about I think he called it the Big Society or the Big Society, I think he called it. Yeah.
Society, yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and I think and a lot of the things that, in abstract, if you took a lot of the things he was talking about, like community, and kind of working together and having shared values and stuff, these are all things that were very positive to me. But his vision of that big society, his vision would have been anathema to me, of course, because his vision would have been hierarchical and kind of benevolent rich people kind of giving charity to the deserving poor and stuff, that kind of thing. But I very strongly believe that we need more community, that we need, but in my recent dealings locally with the community that lives around me, it's very much a case that certain people decide who the community is and who isn't part of the community, and because there are power structures within that. So there's always a problem. I mean, that somebody will do something and I'll think, well, there's something to look at and say, there's a man that you might not have expected this kind of behavior based on strong values to have done, and that person might be exemplary for that moment, but I wouldn't adopt him as a broad kind of role model. And now, and I'm still very cautious because of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, where Jordan Peterson suddenly turned up, and to very, very early days sounded like somebody who was being quite rational and maybe defending freedom of speech, and then turned out to be this monster, in my view, this monstrous phenomenon. And a lot of young men attached themselves to him almost hook, line, and sinker. And that was, that obviously that was scary. So I think role model is something that I question, but I like the idea that that we look at men again and say, let's find out what to value in men, and look at examples rather than maybe role models, exemplars of certain kind of behaviors. Gary Lineker, someone like him, I would never have thought of myself saying, look at Gary Lineker, for example, defending freedom of speech. I mean, to me, he was just a soccer player before, but now he's someone I think, oh, he's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
There's twice now he's come out and taken risks to say, it doesn't matter what your politics are, freedom of speech is something worth defending. So,
yes. Yeah. So I'm conscious that the minutes are ticking by, and we have poet Nikolai Duffy here, and he has a question for both of you. To what extent does the sense of never really knowing our parents impact the way we might think about them or respond to their legacies? And how might that impact the way we relate to our own children, that we might never be fully known by them or know them fully either?
Yeah, that's that, isn't it? That question about allowing your parents to be independent people and people who had their own motives and damage. And I haven't got kids, so I don't have to think about it the other way around. But John,
I think to take that forward, from one generation or two generations, the recognition that one comes to, because when one's as a child, we think we know our parents. We think we know them very well, in fact. We think, we come to some time in our mid-teens or maybe our 20s, whenever, when something happens and we realize that there was something about a parent that we really didn't know about. It was very surprising. And that might shock us, and we might feel quite upset about that. But as you get older, of course, you start to, you become more forgiving, I hope. But also one learns that everyone's mysterious. Parents and, friends and oneself. We're all mysteries to some extent, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually rather a good thing. And that means that then when our children turn out to be mysterious or surprising, that we're more able then to let them be that, let them be who they are, and not try and make them conform to what we'd hoped they were going to be. I mean, I one of my fears when having kids was that I would try and live out some kind of fantasy new version of my life, the life I didn't have, rather, through my kids, because my father curtailed so much of what I could have done. It's how I saw it. and the society the poverty in particular that I lived in, curtailed so much of my life. And my kids don't want my life, but not even my dream life or my ideal life. They want their lives, and what they want sometimes is quite mysterious to me. But I hope that I've learned from the mysteries of my parents and maybe myself to let them be the mysteries that they want to be or tend to be.
That's really nice. Yeah. Fiona, just quickly before we have to stop, I wondered about the sliding doors experience that you have all the time. Is that something that continues for you into your 60s now?
I don't know. I mean, I've only just turned.
You only just turned 60. Sorry, I should say in your late 50s. Sorry.
Yeah. And I guess I probably wouldn't be quite, as it were, so old at this stage of my life had I, you know, felt more in control of my life earlier, I guess. I don't know. No, I think that the sliding doors sense of, had it not just been for that, you would have had a whole different life, is it's historic. That's to say, I mean, of course, it's all true for all of us every day, you know. Phew, I didn't step in front of that car, which I didn't hear coming around the corner, you know, whatever. It's a kind of, you know, extreme example. But that sense of, you know, I could nearly have been someone else, or we could all nearly have been someone else. I think that I think that feels historic to me. I think that doesn't worry me anymore. I'm quite happy with who I am, and I'm quite happy to have managed to get here, as it were. But I think that for a long time it did. For a long time, maybe that sense of absence, that sense of only flickering into presence, was to do with inauthenticity. And I think I probably have a little bit of an obsession with authenticity. I have a little bit of an obsession with emotional honesty, straightforwardness, transparency. I'm not good at and don't like game playing, as it were, politicking in the workplace, or social game playing. I can't really manage all of that. I kind of need to have a kind of, in a way, naive, a kind of primary colored authenticity. I might be discreet, or I might keep a secret, but I can't be dishonest. And it's not because I'm a good person. It's because authenticity is the most valuable sort of touchstone, not commodity, but experience that I can have.
Great. Well, I think we're down to literally the last minute, so I just want to thank you both so much. And honestly, what a superfluity of gifts we've had across the screen this evening. As John, I told you about the David Cohen Prize, and anyone who hasn't read any of John's work should definitely go out tomorrow straight away and get some, and Fiona's too. And anyone who's read Fiona's piece will know that she, as a child, was a gifted violinist, and I believe it's true that Tippett used to write music for her. She was that good.
No, he didn't write music for me. I played his music to him.
Oh, you played his music to him. Yeah. That's quite amazing. And then she put aside her violin and started to write her amazing poetry. So we're very, very lucky to have had both of you with us this evening, and I'm very grateful indeed. And anyone who hasn't read your pieces in the tablet, please let me know and I'll send them.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Thank you for the commission.
No.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Really nice. And I'll hand over to Amanda.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much to take on board there. And it's the language that you use to describe your experiences absolutely blown me away. I will be looking at this recording again because I just want to but absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm just going to go through some of the things that are coming up now in the tablet. Obviously, we have the second. We've had the second of this series, and we're going on to look at the third in the tablet webinar series, Family Matters. And we have Joanna Muirhead, who will be talking to, in conversation with Mary Kenny, who's an Irish journalist, broadcaster and playwright. Joanna's written about losing her sister when she was just 3 years old, And Mary has written about being a daughter, wife and mother, and reflects on how God triumphs through suffering. So that one is coming up on the 29th of November. We also have our series of Advent events coming up, where we do this every year. So we have 4 speakers talking to us as we work our way through Advent. The carol service is on the horizon, so please don't forget that. The date for that is all featured in the tablet. And you can see that we have All Saints Catholic College Schola Cantorum, and we'll hear festive readings. We've got some amazing guest speakers coming to that. You'll know who they are when you see them, so I'll leave that little tease there for you. And we've also got coming up in January the Dialogue of the Heart, Dialogues, Disputes and Dreams Among Jews, Christians and Muslims. That's a pastoral review event, so please do look out for that. If you're looking to get away at the beginning of December, we've still got places on our Advent in Rome trip. That's the 8th to the 13th of December, our 4-star hotel, and you'll be there with Sister Gemma Simmons, who's the spiritual guide for that evening. And looking a bit further afield, we have India, Churches and Temples of the South. Again, a trip organised with McCabe and the tablet. And we have our Krakow 7-day pilgrimage of remembrance trip. All of the details of those can be found in the tablet. If you're not already a subscriber to the Pastoral Review or the tablet, then just go to the tablet website and you'll find easy ways to subscribe to all of our titles. And if you don't want to subscribe, we have many people on our waiting list in schools and also in prisons who would like a copy of the tablet. So please do again have a look at the tablet website for all the details of that. We've just finished our Tablet Development Fund appeal for 2023. If you've not had a chance to donate, then again, you can go onto the website and give as little or as much as you want, because the tablet is a registered charity. And if you'd like to donate to us, just go to www.thetablet.co.uk Development Fund. Many thanks again for supporting these tablet webinars. Thank you again to our speakers. It's been an absolutely wonderful evening. Thank you for your time and good evening to everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your evening. Good night.
Good night.